Hi, everyone. Welcome to Farsight's Fellowship Career Counseling. I'm really delighted today to have Caleb Watney here. I've had the pleasure of collaborating more indirectly with you on a few different bits. For example, one of them is the upcoming Progress Conference, together with a few other really wonderful progress-oriented organizations in the space. Thank you so much for joining us here. Before we do a little bit of a brief intro to you, maybe it would be useful to also hear from our fellows. And so maybe we can just go one by one and just maybe say your name, any affiliation that you want to mention, and something that you're really interested in either talking to Caleb about or just generally learning, and then we can see if we can cover it. Okay, Tommy, I see you first.
Hi, Thomas Sebastian, senior staff at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. I do a lot of work in early concept development across a wide range of aerospace domains, space fellow with Foresight. Don't have any questions yet. Looking to understand a little bit more about what you do, Caleb, and your career path and trajectory.
Okay, next one, Ekaterina, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Ekaterina. I'm living in France right now, and I'm a fellow the Space Tech Group at Foresight Institute. So by education, by profession, I'm a physicist, and I work on and lead on the project within advanced space concepts and technologies, notably within lunar exploration topics. I do a lot of projects that, ranging through multiple fields, because it looks like space is highly interdisciplinary sector. And I'm mostly interested in topics like connected innovations, moving concepts from lab to market, and space for all. One of my projects is directed to the, let's say, being part of the space workforce to more and more people, because maybe some of you already know that to work in the space sector, it's quite difficult. Space sector has a lot of limitations. It's quite a closed sector. But yeah, this is one of the things I'm interested in. And just talking briefly about what I would be interested in, let's say, looking for during this meeting, again, Caleb, I would be just interested to learn what you do and your views on different topics. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And Nicolo?
Hi, very nice to meet you. It's a great opportunity to get to chat with you and hear from your experience. My name is Nicolo. I helped co-found OpenBioML, which is a community dedicated to machine learning and biology, especially open source research in that intersection. Currently, I'm working with the Amaranth Foundation for a project related to the intersection between neuroscience and AI safety. And I'm generally interested, I believe it's going to be huge from all points of view. And I'm generally interested in any way to make the future go well. And in general, what we can do both for AI systems in the future, because I believe they will be worthy of moral consideration as well, but also for humans. And in general, what we can do is make sure the future goes well for everyone in general. Just a quick note, I have unfortunately a conflicting meeting in 10 minutes or so, but we'll join back as soon as I can.
What would be the best way to kick off? I'm happy to do a kind of an intro on myself. And
that would be amazing. Please.
Great. Okay. Great. So yeah, hi, I'm Caleb. Great to meet you all. So I'm based in DC. I'm the co-founder of the Institute for Progress. We are a nonpartisan innovation policy think tank that was launched just a little under 3 years ago. We cover a wide range of topics in the innovation and science policy space, including meta science, which we think of as the US government is the single largest funder of basic science in the world. And yet we know surprisingly little about how that money is spent or what are actually the ways of spending it that can help us get the most bang for our buck. I think there's a lot of concerns that the way we fund science right now, leading people to work on low risk incremental research, and we could be finding ways to incentivize more high risk, high reward stuff. So that's bucket one. We also do a lot of stuff around high skilled immigration, trying to make it easier for scientists, engineers, mathematicians from all over the world to come and live and work in the US. There's some cool research papers that show US immigration policy matters not only for the US, but also for the global advancement of science. If you look at International Math Olympiad winners, these are like basically high schoolers, students from all over. They compete in this big international math competition. And if they move to someplace like the UK, they end up being about twice as productive as they would otherwise be if they'd stayed in their home country. But if they're able to move to the US, they end up being about 6 times as productive, 4 to 6 times. And they're just really large productivity gains of I think, helping the best and brightest get plugged into these top scientific ecosystems all over the world. So that's bucket 2. Bucket 3, we do a fair bit of work on infrastructure, which we think pretty broadly about. It includes everything from construction productivity to housing to energy. But a lot of these are actually, they have shared connections between, in the US, we've just made it really hard to build in the physical environment. Doing anything new inevitably gets caught in the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act, which adds 3 to 5 years of kind of review before you can do anything. And so paradoxically, these laws that were intended to help protect the environment are actually making it really hard to deploy clean energy like solar and wind and geothermal in the US. We also do stuff around biotechnology. And there's like 2 components of this. One, there's what are important defensive technologies that would be good for us to accelerate to help prevent future pandemics, things like FAR-EPC for indoor air quality, super PPE, early detection for virus kind of warning systems. And then we're also doing some stuff around clinical trial reform, trying to make it faster to be able to get to market once you have a cool innovation. And then the last bucket is emerging tech, which is broad. Mostly we work on AI policy. We're doing a lot of stuff around AI and state capacity. Are there ways to help build up infrastructure within the US government to think more rationally about AI, help get talented people in there? We've been doing a lot of work, especially on the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is a really important body in the US and it's really underrated, not getting the resources they need. And so we're trying to see how we can support them. So that's the broad swath of issues we work on. In general, it's motivated by the idea that the US has this really important role as the R&D lab of the world. Innovation is a global public good. And we both need to use that there's like a moral responsibility we have to continue pushing out the global frontier, but also use that power to shape the pathway of technology and science in a way that makes sure it's good for all humanity.
Awesome. I was trying to take notes of all the different topics and threads that we can pull on. It was very difficult. That's a lot. I didn't even, not even all of it was like available publicly, but this is amazing. Okay, lots of overlap. If you guys have any questions, Nicolo, Ekaterina, Tommy, just a reminder, raise your hand anytime. Just interrupt me. This is for you guys. I'm just going to kick us off with a little bit. Meta science is one of your broader buckets, really, that you guys are interested in. Could you tell perhaps our fellows a little bit, how do you think about meta science? How is it related? Because our fellows are mostly in individual scientific or technological disciplines, or like squaring 2 or 3 of them. But what is meta science? Why would they care? How might it affect their career?
Really? So I think there's 2 layers to this. There's like, why does meta science matter in the abstract? And then there's what would thinking about meta science help in terms of the object-level technological areas that you guys care about? I think on the first, like the case to care about meta science is that we know in the long run of human history, the thing that really drives humanity forward is scientific and technological progress. Why are we so much better than our ancestors who were living in the 1700s? Mostly it's because, we have things like indoor plumbing and air conditioning and semiconductors and all the wonderful things that have come from those kind of technologies. And so it's always good to spend money. I think for the most part, we know that R&D has huge public spillovers when innovators create some new scientific breakthrough. They're actually capturing a tiny portion of the benefits there, which is good, I think, the basic economist case for why we should be spending public resources on innovation in the first place. But then one step up from this is that we can apply the scientific method to the way that we fund and structure science. And as obvious as an idea that might seem, it's actually a kind of not something that we've taken seriously. And we've basically, especially in the US, funded science in almost the exact same way since the 1960s and 70s, when a lot of these early institutions formed, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. Mostly it's a kind of a consensus-oriented peer review process where you as a scientist will submit a giant application to one of these bodies. You'll hear back in 18 months. A panel of 5 to 10 other experts in your field will jointly agree on which things are the most promising. And I don't want to say that's a bad way to fund science, but it is only one way. And I think the single biggest push is for more diversification, more experimentation. Let's try a bunch of other things. There's been excitement around things like the ARPA model. So DARPA is a big science funder in the US. People have pointed to the cool innovations they've been able to make around things like GPS satellites and even mRNA vaccines they played a role in, as well as the early internet. And they have a very different model of funding science. They have a highly empowered individual program managers who have a whole vision for a technological field, and then they can make uncorrelated bets across the field and really push people. But it's very different from the traditional peer review system that NIH does or NSF does. And so it's a basic question, when do these systems work better? When do they work worse? What are the attributes of a problem that would lead some kinds of funding mechanisms to be better than others? What can we say about how the structure of science has changed? And these are just like big open questions. And actually, it's only some of these big science bodies like the NSF or the NIH that have the ability to even create data on them in the first place, because they are the ones with the big sample sizes, basically. I think from a like an ROI perspective, if the US is spending, somewhere around, at least between NSF and NIH, $70 billion, they could spend a couple of $1 million to make the scientific process 3% better, say, and that would more than pay for itself many times over. And because science is just like this single big trend pushing humanity forward, really small leverage points in making the scientific process itself better can just have really high return. So I put that on that first bucket about like, why does meta science matter? So why would caring about meta science affect the specific issues you work on? I think it's just useful to understand like where your issue fits within the broader landscape of science. And if you're working on nanotechnology, or if you're working on super PPE, you probably want quite different kinds of scientific support systems for that. And knowing what kinds of metaphors to be pulling from, what kinds of systems are most analogous or not. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And being able to learn from, I think, the lessons of how other scientific fields have grown and developed is always going to be, I think, a pretty important reference point for your own field.
Awesome. So you already talked about, okay, maybe it's just a little bit of spending that could go a very long way in improving the process. And you mentioned one example of maybe empowering specific program managers, building more programs in which specific program managers are wildly empowered to do ambitious bits and put their money behind it. And I think we had Jason on a little while ago, and we were also diving into the fact that this is happening a little bit. At least in San Francisco, you have a few kind of like more private foundations or different types of 501c3 and et cetera structures that are almost run like a private DARPA or like a private ARPA for various different goals. So would you think that's a possible mechanism by which to do this, or are there any others that you want to highlight in terms of if one want to like spend a few million or even like what would one change?
Great question. I almost think about the traditional peer review process and the ARPA model as being on two different ends of a spectrum, which is like, how much discretion do individual people have to be able to make decisions, and like how much consensus do you need across the process? And traditional peer review is quite consensus oriented, and DARPA is quite anti-consensus oriented, but there's lots of different midpoints around that. Just to give a couple of examples. One idea that's beginning like some purchase is that you could add a golden ticket to the existing system, where basically right now, what gets funded through a peer review process is mostly a consensus oriented thing. You could give each individual reviewer, though, the opportunity to say, I want to champion this specific proposal. Even though the rest of my colleagues may not be excited about it, I think it's very promising, and I want to use my leverage to push this forward. More ambitiously, you could do things like quadratic voting or something, although I think that's like a bit more out there for the Overton window. But at the very least, it's starting with the idea that like people also use the analogy to America's Got Talent or some of these award shows where there's a number of judges, and you just need one to get excited about it and push the ball forward. And that might be one way of kind of funding more high risk, high reward research. There's also, I think, questions around what sorts of funding mechanisms are you using? Because we're all talking about grants as like the default way, but there's many other ways of funding science. And so people have been getting excited around things like innovation prizes or advanced market commitments or loan guarantees is the big way that the federal government funds innovation currently. People want to start development banks. People want to do, also NASA is oftentimes helping give SpaceX their launch by using this pretty creatively designed milestone-based contracts to help get them the leverage they needed to get to the International Space Station for kind of some contracts there. And so actually one project we've been working on is this idea of creating a innovation atlas, which tries to map out the conceptual landscape of all of these different kinds of innovation financing mechanisms, and then providing the decision-making criteria for, based on the attributes of a particular problem, when would you know when you want to use traditional grants versus an innovation prize versus an advanced market commitment versus kind of whatever. And so we're hoping to have a prototype of that kind of in the next couple of months, but I'm quite excited about that. I think it could be a useful way to help explore this space.
That's amazing. We are about to launch like a new lo-fi emulation prize, and there were various different ways to structure that. One of it would have been with a grant attached to it, not with a grant attached to it, different types of prizes, whether it's a challenge or like a grant prize in the end. And we also used this decision-making rubric on it. It was really helpful.
That's great.
It was really quite amazing if you just start thinking about it. And there's so many different mechanisms in which you can do that anyways. But yeah, this is awesome. I can't wait to get my hands on it. And Tommy, you're up.
Sure. I just wanted to push maybe a little bit on the DARPA model a little bit.
Yeah.
I've been on a number of white teams. And so one of the reasons I think DARPA gets rightly highlighted as a success model is because, it's not necessarily consensus based, but it is to some degree. If you're a PM and you come in with an idea, you're put in front of basically the idea is you're brought in and you're put in front of a bunch of people and they basically tell you whether your ideas are stupid or not. So like the first wicket, and then of the ideas that are not stupid, they're trying to help you make them better. They hammer you with the Heilmeier catechism. Some of them will say one metric works better than another, and you go from there. But the other part of it is, I think a lot of the things that are put out by DARPA, the performers on them are people who have something that is 6.1, and not necessarily 6.1, 6.2, 6.3 type stuff that is applied. It's not necessarily fundamental research, right?
Yeah.
The problem is substantially harder for NIH and NSF. They're looking at fundamental research where the payoff is, it's tough tech problems that the payoff is potentially decades out. DARPA PM who lasts 2 to 3 years. There's a quick turn success, press release, blah, blah, blah cycle there that you don't necessarily see with NSF things. The other part of it is most NSF funding goes to university researchers, and if you're trying to go from assistant professor to associate, the publish or perish paradigm and the departmental politic associated with that is a fundamentally different world that you're operating in versus, say, somebody who's a performer at a small startup that got a SIBR or something to pursue some realization of a technology to develop, right? So I feel like it's a bit chicken and egg to compare the two. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's totally fair. And I guess I don't, all of these things are somewhat conceptual, right? We're trying to map them on. And so certainly there's a lot of differences. And I think it's totally correct that what NSF is trying to do is just fundamentally very different from what DARPA is trying to do. And I mean, my single biggest message is that each funding apparatus should what I was afraid of sometimes, DARPA has had some very public successes. And so then we're like, oh, let's just copy paste the ARPA model everywhere. And let's create a DARPA for transportation and a DARPA for agriculture and a DARPA for whatever. And I'm open to the idea those specific.
We have ARPA age, we have all these other things.
Right.
And the other part, but the thing people don't talk about is behind the curtain, there are so many DARPA failures but they're willing to take on those failures. And they also have, I think, the grace to not necessarily publicize some of them, right? Or a large fraction of them, which I don't know that some of the other organizations have that flexibility. And having the ability to do that is very enabling for DARPA.
Totally.
Other organizations have.
I think that's right. And so I think ARPAs work quite well if there are a series of very specific engineering or technical bottlenecks that would, something, maybe the basic science for something is already known, but it hasn't been able to make the broad scale commercialization yet. And someone just really needs to take a crack at it. Economists sometimes say that there's a 20 to 30 year lag between when the basic science is known and when it's out in the world deployed. And I think about the ARPAs as being a place to fold that space-time continuum. And if it normally takes 20 or 30 years, maybe you can fold it until 5 years or 3 years if you have an ambitious kind of ARPA program around it. So there can be a lot of value in doing that, but there have to be a lot of preconditions that are not necessarily going to always make sense for all kinds of problems. Going back to the basic science thing, a different contrast with the traditional peer review system would be a system that really bets on individual people rather than projects. And the ARC Institute is one example of this, which is funded by a number of folks, including Patrick Collison, but is trying to give very large, unstructured, and flexible funding arrangements to individual scientists. And they're just betting on talent, basically saying, you as a scientific contributor, we think you're really promising. We're going to give you 7+ years and tens of millions of dollars to both fund you and your lab and any sort of assistance you may need on kind of the operational or the technical side to help you make progress here. And that is, quite different from, I think, at least how the traditional peer review system works. However, it is worth noting that within the NIH, there's a lot of variation. There's this particular program, the MIRA program, Maximizing Individual Researchers Initiative. I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's basically a people rather than project-based funding. It's not quite as large or as flexible as something like ARC, obviously, which I think would be potentially a way to expand it and improve it over time. But it's worth noting that this is now almost half of NIGMS's budget, which is the main kind of institute that does basic biomedical science kind of within the NIH. And so these institutions are learning, they're trying things, and I think that's good. I would like them to sometimes try faster or be a bit more rigorous in the way that they're trying out things, which is a whole nother thing. Is the difference between a pilot versus an experiment is actually an effort to try to have a control group to measure and see what's changing over time. But there's a lot of variation in some sense already across the
Cool. Awesome. Maybe we leave it there on the meta science thread just for now. We can come back to it anytime. I know there's a million other threads to pull on there. But I was also really excited about the biotech defense bit that you mentioned. I think the fellow that had originally recommended that we speak to you was actually really excited about the DTD approach, related to biotech that you guys have, which
Yeah.
I find that much even about. So I'm really interested to have you speak perhaps a little bit more about it. I think most of our fellows have an understanding of the differential technology development model, with Alex posters out there and so forth. But if you could, yeah, I guess give a little bit more context on your specific approach to it and which areas you think are quite exciting there, and why should we care about this differential technology development approach? And also, what is it not? I think it's already getting a
Yeah.
little bit whitewashed, or it's definitely being used for specific areas where I'm just like, is this really so defense acceleratory? I'm not sure.
The hard part about it is that at some basic level, it's like fund good things more, fund bad things less. Make good things go faster, make bad things go slower, which when phrased in that way, it's like almost tautological. Of course, this is good and we should do it. And then all of the juice comes from how do you decide what these things are? When I think about what's useful about it, I think there's a couple of things. One is just like re-emphasizing the idea that there's a lot of path dependency in science and technology. The way that things developed is not inevitable. The way that things will develop in the future is not written in stone. We have a lot of agency as humanity and as a society to like shape things. Secondly, that some technologies are more important than others, and we shouldn't just assume that the default ordering of technologies or pace at which they will develop is going to naturally be best. There's this, he is mostly thought of as being this, we should accelerate defensive technologies. And I think it's good and appropriate and a totally fair thing. But there's totally another angle on this that you could look at. My friend Jacob Trevethan, who works at Open Philanthropy, has a really great blog post called 10 Technologies That Won't Exist in 5 Years. And he's writing kind of from the global health and R&D perspective and looking at 10 specific vaccine targets or other kinds of platforms that could be enormously useful for saving millions of lives across the globe. That just like won't by default happen because the market is not aligned to solve it because, yeah, that's the post. Thanks for sharing. Because the people that would benefit don't have the ability to pay, basically. And the global pharmaceutical companies are naturally more inclined to try to solve problems that people in the rich Western world have because you can make a lot more money there. And so just pointing out these market structure things, there's lots of market failures, basically, all across technology and science development. Some of these market failures are security related or defensive kind of related. And I think that's where the traditional differential tech development framework helps. But I almost want to emphasize that this is broader than just security. And there's lots of ways in which, like, there are externalities built into the kinds of systems that we're developing, and we should be thoughtful and careful. And I think there's an important role for the public sector to play in basically putting a thumb in the scale in favor of technologies that are not going to happen by default or that might like be neglected to the extent. So that's where I find it useful. I think from IFP's perspective, we spend a lot more of our time focusing on the defensive acceleration side rather than like the offensive deceleration side. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it's more our bailiwick. It's the kind of thing that we work with. Most of our policy levers are on things like, hey, like how can we use NSF funding to make X go faster? So there's a lot of natural kind of things there. I'm also just like a bit more pessimistic about our ability to, even if you could identify bad things, slowing them down is just quite hard. One, I think it tends to be like less tractable. Two, you have to be like a lot more. It's a higher risk strategy, basically, slowing things down rather than differentially speeding things up. There's like a worldview diversification. How confident you are about your priors? What happens if you're wrong? And I really like prioritizing interventions that are robustly good and across a wide range of potential scenarios. And I think it's almost always going to be safer to say, hey, this technology seems like it could be really defensively good or good for public health or whatever, and it's not going to get the prioritization it would otherwise get. Let's put a thumb on the scale in terms of speeding that up. You have to be just like a lot more confident about your own priors to say, I know for sure that this thing is bad. Let me slow this down and cause a lot of ruckus. I think also a lot of our scientific systems and architects are built up to, we have many more layers to speed things up through the ARPAs and whatever. Obviously, we have things like regulation to slow things down, but people don't even think about regulation as traditionally being a thing that slows things down. It's more about making sure that certain guardrails are built. As a society, defensive acceleration it comes much more easy to us. I think it's more tractable. And as I mentioned, I think it's more robustly good under a wide range of scenarios than slowing things down. Not to say that there's like never a role for that, like bioweapons development. Obviously, I don't want to accelerate bioweapons development. And if we want to slow it down in certain ways, that seems good to me. But I think from IFP's perspective, we mostly focus on kind of the defensively speeding things up.
Yeah, I think that's definitely also the angle that we pick. I think it's easier, especially if you are working with scientists and technologists, to be like, not just, no, you can't work on any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, here are a few really good opportunities that we would really like to draw your attention to. I think it's just like a much more kind of like proactive, optimistic, and I guess like incentivizing strategy.
Totally.
And if you think a little bit of like Thomas and Ekaterina's perhaps fields that which are space related, are there any kind of like DTD angles that you want to point out there? I know that you guys focus mostly on the biotech angle, at least that's what you just said, I think. But is there anything like in that space sector where you're like, oh, this is something really good to work on, where I wish more eyes were on the ball?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know a lot less about the space sector, so I don't want to pretend to have expertise that I don't have. I feel like I've heard other people say that things that are mostly monitoring related, better detection capabilities seem like maybe more robustly good, more defensive if we know where all the various satellites or space debris or asteroids or all that sorts of things. It seems very hard to imagine where better detection capabilities are going to go wrong versus there are other ways in which things are maybe more dual use. But I don't actually have that much expertise about the space sector. And I don't know as much, but I'm happy to, if you guys have thoughts or ideas, feel free to jump in. We could do some more brainstorming.
Yeah, Tommy, Ekaterina, do you have any hunches for areas where you're like, oh, this would probably be robustly good to accelerate faster than perhaps like other developments in space that are coming online?
But I would certainly say space medicine. The research that we can do in microgravity, of course, it's rapid benefits Earth directly. And at the same time, I think in space medicine, we can consider multiple fields, including, for example, radiation defense. It certainly has a lot of applications on Earth, right? I would also say space agriculture. We actually certainly have this technology transfer between Earth and space, precise monitoring of the probes using the satellites. And unfortunately, we see that the climate conditions on Earth are getting worse and worse. And it means that we will need to find other ways how to, let's say, grow our food sustainably and having constant access to food, no matter what climate conditions you have outside today. But certainly, these two fields, I think, have direct application both for space and for Earth, and I don't think there can be something bad out of it. Yeah, I would choose these two fields first.
Yeah, if you look at Planet Labs, I think their monitoring capabilities are really quite incredible, especially for agriculture, but also for methane detection and so forth that's coming online now. So I guess monitoring also, if used as surveillance, can also have possible downsides to it. So I guess there's definitely some judgment calls to make. But in general, I would agree.
And certainly everything that's connected to manufacturing, recycling, salvaging materials would be nice to be able to recycle everything we use on Earth. Why not?
Okay, Tommy, do you have any ideas?
Few ideas. So there's as you mentioned correctly, there's the orbital debris problem. That's one challenge. There are groups that are trying to figure out what to do with those spent stages, right? If you're able to do something with the spent stages, those are the big things. The big things when they become lots of small things are harder to deal with, right? What are things you could do with those big things? One of the concepts I've heard bouncing around as well, if we want to do things on the moon, it's really hard to excavate things on the moon. If you add a little bit more delta V, can you use those big things to basically spontaneously excavate things on the moon? And thereby you have that mass already up there. Why not use it, for something useful? Yeah, but there are lots of things. Does that fit into the category of bad idea or good idea? Those are some unique challenges. The other kind of goes to, from a policy standpoint, back when we had the Sputnik overflight, the US did not take any shots on it. The general consensus is your airspace is sovereign. Somebody flies an airplane over your airspace and you don't want them there, you shoot them down, you have every right to do so. We decided, and we set as the rules for the road, that is not the case for spacecraft, right? Which is good for everyone. But there's this interesting kind of space that's developing in the 90 kilometer to 120 kilometer VLEO space, where the rules of the road are a little vague and no one really knows what that should look like. And I think trying to figure out what should those rules of the road be that enable technology development for the benefit of everyone while respecting sovereignty between different territories and countries and things. So I think technology itself doesn't exist in a vacuum, but that's
right.
One of those things where I think we should all be cognizant of. Also, I was very briefly looking through this top 10 things that won't get funded, and programmable drugs for future pandemic got my attention, especially with the earlier mention of DARPA, considering that the 2017 P3 effort from DARPA may very well be one of the reasons we have RNA vaccines. It is one of those success stories that people don't really talk about a whole lot, but it's I think highlighting the fact that taking technologies that are at some like low TRL and then bringing them up to a point where they could have some significant impact. DARPA has an army, every PM has an army of CETAs to help them do that. I don't know if that's the case for NIH or NSF. And so from a minimum investment for maximum like return standpoint, I feel like some of that might just be bandwidth for the people that are leading some of these things. At least that's an external observer's take anyway.
Yeah, I think that seems right. I also posted this link in the chat. That's an article from a friend of mine that I'm fond of about building a telescope array on the far side of the moon and kind of how much more useful that might be for helping us understand the origins of the universe than just building another particle collider, which would be cool too, but maybe we should try something else. Since I think that'd be a cool idea.
Yeah, Eli's writing in general is awesome. He wrote a really wonderful post on nanotech spring that has definitely, much delighted many people in the FOSSA community. Okay, awesome. And now that we have, Nicolo, you already raised your hand. I was going to get to AI neurotechnics. Here you go. Go for it.
I was just wondering, so one topic I've had on my mind recently is that to some extent we can think about this period as a period of transition between a world which is driven from the point of view of research and development by humans for the most part. And if we extrapolate to a long enough time frame, depending on one's views, it may be 10 years if someone is extremely aggressive. It may be 20, 50 years, but still, it's the beginning of a transition period to a world which is increasingly driven by AI in terms of research and development. You mentioned earlier about some of the bottlenecks in the context of human-driven research and development, where, of course, it makes sense to focus on, for example, immigration, because you want to bring the best people available from all over the world in the US, such. I'm curious if you have thought in terms of how we can prepare from a policy perspective about a world in where R&D is increasingly AI driven.
Yeah, great question. And something that I wouldn't say I have great answers to, lots of, I think, follow-up questions myself and something that we're trying to think deeply about and we're currently investigating. I think there's one framing I like for this is what are questions that become more or less important in worlds where AI starts doing a lot of R&D. I think one thing that starts to look more important is which scientific fields have really fast feedback loops versus which ones have very slow feedback loops or messy ones. And pure mathematics seems like something that can be automated relatively soon. You get like a theorem checker that's really good and you can just like brute force really important kind of breakthroughs in pure mathematics. So like it's almost much closer to self-play or something like AlphaGo, where you can just play yourself millions to billions of times, make really important insights, and move the ball forward. Obviously, there's a lot of areas where that's not like that. And I think medicine is one where we can have better and clinical trial reform. Conceptually, you could say, how do you shorten the feedback loop between hypothesis generation and then actually testing this out in the real world? Also, is my internet okay? I'm not sure if I'm paying out.
I think you're lagging out a bit. Yeah.
Could you just repeat the last sentence that you said, or the last two maybe? I think the rest we all caught.
Just saying that what are ways to shorten the timeline between hypothesis generation and exploration in the real world is like an interesting question then. And so things like clinical trial reform maybe start to look more important because that could help you theoretically shorten that feedback loop or get closer to like actually testing all the hypotheses that you're now able to generate with AI-assisted R&D. I think there's a lot of other questions, but those are some of the initial ones that come to mind.
Yeah, there was a really interesting post recently from Sarah Constantine on Less Wrong, basically comparing all the new AI for biotech tools and how they're actually helping, how they're not helping, which ones are really new, and at what point of the kind of biotech scientific explorations phase they come in. And it was really, really useful to just see this categorization. I'll share it maybe here in the chat. But Nico, if you have a follow-up, feel free to go ahead.
Not specifically about this question. I have other questions which I love to ask, but not specifically about.
Go for your next one then.
And by the way, thank you. It's great to get to this opportunity. I'm curious, similarly, long enough time frame as for an outlook, human augmentation in terms of BCIs, for example. I'm also generally a fan of the whole brain emulation concept, and I expect it to be relevant maybe 50 years from now, maybe longer, but I expect it to become important. As far as I understand, we face the issue in aging, where it's not even augmentation. Usually, it's just the fact that it's not even recognized the status of normal biological decay is considered fine, and so it's difficult to justify research and drug development and clinical trials. You have to justify them somehow. Do you have thought in how we can prepare for future technologies that allow us to go beyond what is the normal baseline? And given the bottlenecks that seem to be present currently from the point of view of the FDA and such?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. One part of this is just recognizing that us are going to have to shift, and this is not going to be like a question that's solved in a research vacuum. It's going to be something that is actually going to be, I think, quite a lot of engagement with the public about, especially when you're trying to spend public dollars on things. And I think trying to get too focused on just what are the research bottlenecks without thinking about what is the way in which the public sector or is having a conversation with the rest of society. This is, I think.
Sorry, Caleb, could you maybe back up off again? And maybe I'll turn my video off and maybe you could do the same.
Around. I think there's a lot of ways in which.
Caleb, could you maybe try one more time and maybe I'll turn my video off? Can you hear me? Caleb, can you hear me? Caleb, can you hear us?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you again. Could you maybe try one more time? And maybe it's better with video off to preserve bandwidth, just for now.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry about that.
We heard the first few sentences of the answer, but then when you got into the meat, you were lagging.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just saying that I think a lot of these like biomedical issues can sometimes get quite thorny, and I think sometimes there's an idea that we can just speed run around whatever like the public thinks. But if you're spending public dollars, like inevitably they're going to have opinions, and engaging, I think, more deliberately in like social conversations about what it means to better human longevity or BCIs or whatever is going to be important. But I think maybe my larger thing is just for the near term, there's a lot of ways in which these conversations, I think, could be framed in a more pluralistic or normie way. I think longevity is one where as soon as you start getting into, Peter Thiel blood boys and living forever, people get like very freaked out about it. But I think most everyone would like to see human health spans increased and would like to have more healthy years with their grandchildren. That seems you could get everyone on board, I think, with that idea. And so I think that's probably a good focus area. On the policy side, sometimes actually you can get into an issue where things become like overly pigeonholed around a specific intervention. For example, the National Institutes of Aging, a lot of their money has historically been tied specifically to Alzheimer's research. And it's actually been difficult to use that funding for things that would help us have a better understanding of kind of the fundamentals of human aging, but are not connected to Alzheimer's, at least directly. And so some of the suggestions, I think there's been work to try to make that existing funding just like a little bit more flexible and allow it to go towards more general series of aging rather than just focus on Alzheimer's in particular. And more likely you would actually then be to have breakthroughs on Alzheimer's. But sometimes you have to like take a step back in order to move forward. And sometimes our policy funding can get overly tied to specific interventions.
Oh, that's a big step back if we think about dreams of like whole brain emulation augmentation. Nicolo, did you have a follow-up?
Not specifically about this, but again, I have a few more if there is time, of course.
Okay, we'll maybe go with Ekaterina for the next one, and then we go back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I want to shift our discussion a little bit to immigration. You say that you work also within the immigration policy in the US. So I want to ask you a little bit more general question, your opinion. Right now, we can say that immigration is problematic. If we consider how the world lived, let's say, before 50s of the last century, it was completely different. And right now, if you watch the news, at least occasionally, you probably hear that immigration in most of the cases is used as something negative, especially by the right-wing parties. So I wanted to ask your opinion, what future do you envision for immigration? Like in the next 5, 10 years or 20 years, and what we can do as part of the progress advancements to make immigration more acceptable and easier for much more people than right now.
Yeah, good question. And there's a lot of stuff there. I think one thing we've seen again and again is that the perception of control is almost the single most important political factor for support of immigration. When countries feel like they have policy levers that can actually meaningfully affect the amount of immigration, they actually sometimes are more supportive of larger amounts of immigration. Mostly familiar with the US context, where obviously perceptions of chaos around the southern border have made it really hard to have any sort of productive conversation on immigration. And it's no accident that, countries that have more orderly systems, or at least perceived more orderly systems, end up having higher per capita rates of immigration. Canada has, part of this is just geographical, but they don't have a particularly chaotic border, and per capita rates of immigration in Canada are like so much higher than the US. And I think if there were ways to, create the perception of order and stability, that would actually allow Americans to feel like a lot more comfortable with higher rates of immigration. The related thing here is, what is the type of immigration that's coming in? And if you compare the US to other international kind of industrialized countries, say especially Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, almost all of those countries have immigration systems that are much more explicitly employment oriented rather than family reunification oriented. The US is actually a huge outlier on the share of our green cards that are given out for family reunification, especially for like cousins, adult siblings, parents, adult children. Those are all like quite large green card categories in the US that aren't matched by our international peers. And I think it makes sense that if you ask the average American, what is the typical immigrant that they imagine in their mind, it's not necessarily like the Caitlin Carricos of the world. I think if it were the Caitlin Carricos of the world, they would actually want much higher rates of immigration. And so I think one argument we've made is that by shifting the US system more towards an employment-based system, the perception of immigration would change, and actually Americans might then support higher rates on that of immigration. Because all those countries I mentioned, they both have more employment-based systems and they have higher per capita rates of immigration than the US. I think, again, one lesson is that sometimes you can't sidestep political constraints. We have to run into them head on. And so I think making immigration such an obvious slam dunk that this obviously benefits you as native-born workers is going to be key for sort of political stability of immigration in the long run. And that's another thing, is that we're not trying to increase immigration at any particular point in time. We're trying to create a system that is stable and can support higher rates of immigration for 10, 20, 30 years. And so again, having systems that seem orderly, systems where it's more employment-based, systems where it's like prioritizing high-skilled, both gets you the larger productivity effects in terms of maximizing the R&D capacity of the US, but then I think also increases political stability. I don't have as great, I'm just less familiar with the immigration systems of Europe. And so I don't want to say I have great suggestions for other folks, but at least for the US.
If we solve, that's already like a lot that would be improved. Okay, thanks a lot. I think that's a really interesting angle that I think also different parties could get behind. So it's like relatively.
Totally. And it's interesting, this writer, Raihan Salam, who is the president of the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank, has made the point before that if you look at the historical literature on immigration to the US, one reason that in some sense it like looks so good statistically is that like it was actually quite hard to move to the US. Before the advent of airplanes, you had to be quite adventurous. You had to be quite sort of like proactive. You had to be potentially have some level of means to be able to get to the United States. But as global kind of transportation systems have become more effective, we shouldn't necessarily assume that you're getting the same strength of selection effects as you have historically. And so that could be a reason for a more explicitly kind of merit-based system, is to almost replicate the historical effects that sort of like geographical separation from the rest of the world we're creating.
Yeah, I guess if I just think about what it took for me to get my visa here, first from a J1 to then H1B cap exam to then green card, it was such a dogged process that I thought it was already a pretty strong selection effect.
For sure.
How hard it was to deal with the system.
Yes. Unfortunately, right now, we're just selecting for people with very long time preferences and ability to put up with bureaucracy, which is not necessarily neatly correlated with scientific impact. But yeah,
our work out-selected. I snuck in there because I'm good at dealing with bureaucracies.
We're glad you made it in.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, and we had Nicola with a few other questions, I think, at the end.
Maybe, Tommy, do you have any? I don't want to take up too much of the...
It's all right. People can raise their hand. We still have 4 minutes. Oh, sorry, Caleb, I'll let you answer this.
Sure, yeah, happy to talk about whatever.
Then if I get another chance, an additional question is to reverse the whole process in terms of, to some extent, you are thinking about solving policy bottlenecks to progress. What's the reverse like? What can, for example, people with an AI background and such do to help you and people like you be more effective? What bottlenecks related to policy can progress help with?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things. One is we need more really smart technical people to consider working in or around government. This is like a state capacity angle, but just there are a lot of really hardworking people in the federal government, but oftentimes they are underpaid, overworked. They don't have access to the kind of resources they would need to be able to make really informed kind of decisions about these really complex emerging tech issues. And so I'm really excited about some of these fellowship programs like the Horizon Institute for Public Service or Tech Congress or the AAAS Fellowship, but all these ways of trying to get smart technical people into government is, I think, really a first order issue because personnel is policy is a common phrase in DC that just, if you want to make good decisions, then ultimately you need to have the right kinds of folks in the decision-making chairs. Another thing is highlighting what are bottlenecks within specific issue areas. I oftentimes find that talking to like technical experts directly about their experience working in a field or their experience working within some government system is like the single best way to identify what are the things that actually matter, because you can try to like armchair theorize about, X and Y and Z seems like a problem. It would be good if we prioritize that. But oftentimes like the reality on the ground is so much more complex. And I think really understanding like the deep technical realities within a field is important for actually identifying how would you then make progress. So, I mean, those are, I think, two specific things. Find ways of maybe contributing your expertise to government directly, or at the very least, be willing to talk to policy folks to help them distill what the technical bottlenecks are.
Oh, yeah, we've always wanted to do like an exchange program between DC and San Francisco, at least for a few months or so. Okay, I think probably the last question possibly goes to Tommy.
Just a quick comment more than anything else. So just to highlight your comment about being able to recruit people to be in those be those decision makers. DARPA PMs actually operate outside of government pay scales. So that's one of the reasons they're able to recruit the kind of people they are, is because they're able to actually find people and pay them what to the degree that that you would want to be able to bring that sort of talent in, where you have somebody with like a huge corpus of experience and knowledge in an area, and they're not taking a quarter of their pay back by supporting DARPA and the DARPA mission. So I think that's one of those areas where investment in people is critical.
Totally agree. And it's interesting. People sometimes cite, if you look at how much Singapore pays to civil servants, it's insane. And actually, for I think top ministers, it's actually benchmarked on like some index of the top 1,000 CEOs that are in Singapore, and they'll pay them like 70% or whatever. It's like you're not going to make as much as the top CEOs because you're in public service, but it's much more in that stratosphere than it is traditional government salaries. Well, one issue that I actually think would be interesting to work on is there is a specially congressionally authorized pay scale for folks working in financial services regulation. So if you're working at the SEC or if you're working at the Federal Reserve, they recognize that kind of the talent pool they are pulling from is just like much more highly compensated. And so it's separate from the GS scale, and you're able to pay higher salaries within a couple of those agencies. And I think one promising area would be to create a new pay scale for tech and scientific roles. Because similarly, again, the talent pool you're competing against is just so much more highly compensated. And so I think the selection effects of, I have so much admiration for the people that are willing to sacrifice the $600K figures they could be getting by working at OpenAI or whatever, and instead go to work at NIST. I think that's really admirable. But hopefully we should, as a society, not ask them to take as much of a sacrifice in order to do that noble thing.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Caleb, for your time. That was like a wild ride through like lots of different fields. And yeah, I'm really excited about what you guys are doing over there. Thank you so much for joining us. Also to our fellows, this was a really fun discussion, hopefully quite useful too. And yeah, if you ever get this kind of like innovation atlas running, I would absolutely love to get my hands on it.
It's really.
It was a really wonderful session. I really appreciate you making time, Caleb. Bye, everyone.